our speaker for today, my work colleague and friend, Dr. Jonathan Jones. Dr. Jones is the History Department Chair at Memphis University School, where he has taught European history and U.S. history, and also AP Art History. He also serves as advisor for the school's Honor Council. A strong proponent of learning from history's painful lessons, he has helped lead student civil rights tours to Montgomery and Selma, Alabama. Last fall, fueled by his alarm at the rising anti-Semitism in our society, he became a teacher fellow for the Tennessee Holocaust Education Commission, and he helped arrange a Holocaust remembrance event at MUS in February of this year. A graduate of Baylor School, Dr. Jones earned a Bachelor of Arts in History at Millsaps College, a PhD in American History at the University of Memphis. He has also attained a graduate certificate in Geriatric Care Management at the University of Florida. Before coming to MUS, he was on the adjunct teaching faculty at the University of Memphis. He previously served as the Director of Business Development at Elect Home Care and Director of MIFA Meals on Wheels. In 2018, he was named the Crosby Chair of Christian Ethics. This endowed chair recognizes an outstanding MUS educator who is an exemplar of Christian ethics in the classroom and in daily life. In May, he received the school's 2026 Distinguished Teaching Award. He's married to Mrs. Joanne Jones, who is a registered nurse, and they have two sons, Paul Jones, MUS class of 2021, and Andrew Jones, class of 2023. Please join me in welcoming my good friend, Dr. Jonathan Jones, to Kirby Pines.
Thank you. Let me get my computer up. Everybody hear me okay? Well, Jean, thank you for that lovely introduction. I didn't write it, and my goodness. Thank you. It's very flattering. I'm honored to be here today. You heard that one of my credentials was as a geriatric care manager. I used to work in senior care, and so I came to Kirby Pines many times through the early 2000s before returning to teaching in 2012. So I've been at MUS since 2012, and my goal is to retire there. So one of the responsibilities that I have is teaching the AP Art History course. So it's college level art history for high school students. And I was essentially voluntold to do that about 10 years ago and taught it up until 2020. And then my colleague, who has a master's in fine arts from Boston College, it seemed unfair to not let him teach it since he had the actual experience. I was self-taught, and he's actually well-trained, so it seemed like a waste. So I let him have the course, and then this past year it came back to me, and I'm thrilled to have it. I couldn't believe how much I missed it, and now you get to see what kind of stuff I do and have a little fun with it. When Pat invited me to speak, she said you would like something along the lines of, the 250 anniversary or the July 4th. And I don't know, I've been toying with this idea for some time about the evolution of American art and its origins and where it comes from. And so I hope you'll indulge me. This is the first time I'm delivering this, and I look forward to your feedback. I hope that it makes sense. So here we go. You know, there are three prominent legends about George Washington. One of those is that he chopped down the cherry tree and then confessed to the crime. Another of those is that he was seen praying privately off by himself prior to the Battle of Valley Forge, which was one of his victories, and then that his false teeth were made of wood. Ouch. The fact of the matter is that they're legends. The first two are absolutely legends. There's no proof to show that that's where it comes from. In fact, both of these legends come from the same source, which is the very first biography ever written about George Washington by a man named Mason L. Weems, also went by Parson Weems. I believe he was a congregational minister. But he wrote the very first biography, and it came out in 1800, about a year after Washington's death. And then it was subsequently updated and reprinted. And so he's the one that actually we have to thank for those legends. So now let me step aside, and then the historian here is saying it's a legend because there is no proof that those events actually happened. In fact, as far as the cherry tree is concerned, that legend, it did not appear until an updated version. So the book came out in 1800. It was reprinted consecutively. So in 1806, that legend about the cherry tree appears for the first time, 5 years after it had been published. Okay? And then the story about him praying before Valley Forge came from one soldier who we're not even sure was at Valley Forge. So, but you know what? It doesn't matter. Because what those two stories speak about with George Washington is his character. That's what we know him to be. And they're absolutely in keeping with the actual historical sources that describe Washington in multiple sources. So it's okay that they're perhaps not true, that they're legends. They still speak to the man who he was. But these legends have staying power. For example, here is a 1975 painting taken from that legend about him praying at Valley Forge and created in a very dramatic fashion. This was painted in 1975, a year before the bicentennial. So that's the impetus for that. In 1928, they reproduced the same image on a commemorative stamp. This is the 150th anniversary of Valley Forge. And the 1928 postage stamp, again, showed Washington like this. Even the Saturday Evening Post got into it. In the 1950s, they published a version of Washington praying at Valley Forge. And then also in the 1950s, the Congressional Prayer Room was built in the U.S. Capitol, and the stained glass commissioned for the altar is Washington in prayer at Valley Forge. So, again, legends have staying power. And again, they reflect who the man is. Now, about those dentures, about those false teeth, they were not wood. In fact, they are even more uncomfortable. They are a metal frame, and then a combination of animal and human teeth were put together. Sometimes the teeth came from deceased people. Sometimes they came from enslaved people. The animal part is what disturbs me the most personally, but, make your own conclusions. So that's what he had to wear. And now you can understand, you can read people seeing Washington and they think that he's upset about something. No, he's got these teeth in, and he's in pain. So, what do we actually know about George Washington? What can we do that's the truth? Well, he is a native Virginian, born in 1731 when it was a colony. He would marry his wife, and they would be married for 40 years, Martha Dandridge Custis. They got married around 1757, 1758. And at that moment, he was already a well-to-do, he's an officer in the Virginia Regiment, basically their militia, but he was also a successful surveyor and land investor. So he had already made a decent living. But when he married Martha, that was the money. She had been married to a very wealthy planter, and so that that ownership becomes George Washington. He absolutely adored her, and also, even though they did not have any children, he would become close with her 4 sons from the first marriage. So that's that connection. His military career started in 1752, and of course would really pick up starting in 1756 with the French and Indian War. That was his first major battle, or first major war. He was an officer in the Virginia Regiment, and he would also lose his first battle. It's the Battle of Fort Duquesne, something that Washington would actually do quite a bit more of in later years. He made a military strategy called the strategic retreat, both honorable and popular. If you read Revolutionary War history, the only way that the Continental Army could have survived is to wait and fight battles that they could actually fight and possibly win. And so Washington never hesitated to spare his men, and he would retreat. He did that quite a bit. After he retires from the military after the War for Independence, he finally gets to become a gentleman farmer, which is what he'd always wanted to do. And then in 1787, the now state of Virginia nominated him to lead the delegation to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. So a man who never shirks his duty, he accepted and led the contingency, which also included James Madison and Henry Knox. They went on to went to Philadelphia, where he was immediately and unanimously selected as the chairman of the convention, which was perfect for Washington because all he had to do was preside and he didn't have to talk, which is what he loved. He was a man of few words, so that was the perfect role for him. After the Constitutional Convention, the newly created Congress, after the Constitution was passed and ratified by the states, the newly formed Congress unanimously chose George Washington to be President of the United States. So he's the only president who was not elected president, per se. Well, that's not true. We have some others who become president because of the first guy dies. But anyway, you get my meaning. One of the things that might surprise you, George Washington was an ardent Federalist. I know that many of you are familiar with his farewell address. It's kind of famous, and it would seem to suggest that he's warning about the problem with political parties. If you go back and read it, what he's actually worried about are the rise of opposition political parties, such as the one that Jefferson and Madison would create a few years later called the Republican Party. He did not want 2 parties. So that's just something that he was very conservative, very much in favor of a strong federal government, and so that's where he was coming from. When he steps down from the presidency in 1797, he returned to Mount Vernon to resume being a gentleman farmer, but less than 2 years later, he died probably of pneumonia. So those are the facts about George Washington, and certainly a celebrated leader. But I got to thinking about how his moment in history coincides with a burst of creative activity. And this happens to be the origins of actual American art. And I'll talk about that in more depth here in just a moment. But as we watch his portraiture evolve through time, we are actually witnessing the coming of age of American art. And that's what I wanted to speak with you today in depth. So I'm going to take you through that journey and also give you a taste of what it's like to have me as an art history teacher. So I hope that works for you. Oops, I got to get over here. There we go. All right. So when we think about American art, we actually need to group them in basically 3 key themes. The first, the intent for artists to introduce to a European audience the recently discovered lands and people of the Americas. So that's going to be the first kind of art from America. Not necessarily American artists, but art about America for a European audience who's very curious about it. Then, as we progress through the colonial period and on into the early federal period, we begin to see the rise of artists, and they are, of course, strongly influenced by European artists and their precedents. That just stands to reason. You'll see why in just a moment. In fact, the first American art is going to be by Europeans. There's just no way around it. And then finally, as we head into the 1800s, the 19th century, we start to see artists begin to shift away from portraiture, which is a good moneymaker. That's why they're doing it. But they start to expand into landscapes. And painting those landscapes, if you can think about what happens in the 1830s and beyond, we're engaged in manifest destiny and moving west. And so that's perfectly timed with the evolution of American art. Okay? So portraiture, as far as landscapes, come along a little bit later. Now, about those European influences, just a real quick reminder of where we had been. As the West was being colonized, the Americas were being colonized, that started during the late Renaissance. And then it was pretty much done by the Baroque period of art, meaning the 1600s, because most of the American colonies were founded, really by the 1660s or so. A few others that are later. So it's the Baroque period in art that's taking place at that time. And here are two prominent examples of Baroque art. On your right, over here, you can see my pointer. Oops, got to turn it on. Let's see. So this guy over here, that's Louis XIV. And as you can see, it is a very prominent portrait of a powerful leader. And that's intentional. I mean, he's the one paying for it. This is what he wants. But the message that he's trying to send with his portrait is that it is the man and not the trappings of a king that make the monarch. And the way that you know this is that here is Louis prominently displayed in all his glory with his family colors and the French king colors, the purple and the gold, the fleur-de-lis. But in the shadows in the back, by the shadows that he's casting, are the throne and the crown. Those are in the background. So it's sort of interesting. He is sending a clear message. It's the man. It's not the trappings. And that is in perfect keeping with who Louis XIV was. It was about him. He was the Sun King. The painting on your left, over here, probably recognize that. It's a Caravaggio painting. And so the second kind of popular painting in the Baroque was religious themed. And so this is the story of Jesus convincing doubting Thomas that he has returned. He's resurrected. And Caravaggio was not only an incredibly gifted artist, but he was also a man of his times. And this is the period in history when theater is emerging. And so when you look at a Caravaggio painting, think of them being staged, because he is absolutely doing that. And then in order to make it even more dramatic, he comes up with a couple of techniques that he's very famous for. You see that jet-black background? That's a technique called tenebrism. And tenebrism helps to put the action of the painting even more forward. So like there's this hard black background, murky and mysterious, and yet in the foreground are these figures in full light, and you can recognize what they're doing. But more interesting than that, what Caravaggio also came up with is the scale of his figures are larger than what would normally be. And then he's got them grouped way up front in the painting. Can you see that? And then something interesting happens, and he does this with almost every one of his paintings. He always reserves a spot for you, the viewer. So if you look at this painting, you see that from Jesus all the way around to Thomas forms almost a circle. You see that? And then the spot for you, the viewer, is right here. And that's where you would find yourself in front of this painting. You would angle to it, and you complete the circle. And now you're part of the scene. And that's the way Caravaggio worked. Both the portraiture and Caravaggio's work are highly advanced. They were masters of their craft. And there's no one in America at this time even close to being this gifted. Okay? But that's the Baroque. So portraiture and religious themed art. Then, a little bit later in the 1700s, it's the rise of the Rococo. So what's happened is that in the previous years, like under Louis XIV, he completely took away the power of the nobles, and they were subservient to him. By the time we get into the later 1700s and Louis XV has surrendered that power, so French aristocrats are back in power and money, and guess what? They're spending it on art. And so a lot of Rococo art is this, the aristocracy at play, having a good time. And the portraits are lighter. There's a lot of use of pastel colors. It's very light, it's very frilly, not very serious art at all, in all honesty. And then the architecture to your right, that's what Rococo architecture looks like. It's not my favorite. It's a little busy, but that was the style back then. And of course you can see that in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles and many other places where they embraced Rococo. Another trend that's happening in the 18th century and the 1700s is the rise of the Enlightenment. That's basically the historical period where thinkers and scholars and academics are taking the scientific method and applying it to human society, government, politics, law, you name it, and trying to figure out how these things work to explain them. And so there's a huge emphasis on science in the Enlightenment, and this is a painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, who transforms the philosopher, that's this gentleman in the red coat there, transforms him from just your basic average academic to something more lofty. I don't want to say godlike, but he's almost as heroic as this guy, Louis XIV, if you think about it. So the role of the scientist has been elevated as he is discussing science with his audience. All right, so the last trend that definitely impacts the U.S. is the neoclassical period. We have another name for that here in America. We call it the Federalist period. And sometimes we also even refer to it as Georgian architecture. All of that applies. So that's Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, who introduced that kind of architecture to the U.S., and it would become extremely popular. And then on the far side, that is Jacques-Louis David, the French painter of the French Revolution and Napoleon's empire. And he is portraying Napoleon as a hero as he crosses the Alps. So, those are the artistic periods that are happening at this time. So what's happening with American art? Well, it starts out very slowly. This is a man by the name of John White, who was from London, and he had heard so much about the New World, and obviously Europeans are seeing the influence that the Spanish are having, that he traveled to Roanoke Island. We think around 1585. He was also a map maker, so he had double duties. Once he got to Roanoke, he began painting watercolors, and so this captures a typical scene of Native Americans in and around Roanoke, and they're sharing a meal. And this sort of thing would then get sent back to London, and oftentimes turned into an engraving and then published in newspapers. So that's how Europeans are getting news about the New World. We think that this watercolor is the oldest surviving visual record by a European artist of Native Americans in what is now the United States. So John White could conceivably be called the first American artist, but he's not American. And more importantly, there is no America yet. So keep that in mind. All right, so As I mentioned earlier in the definition, portraits are going to be very important, and that's what carries art along. And so it's not very long in our history, in fact, in the 1670s, that artists began popping up, and they're painting the portraits of wealthy people. Now, we don't know who this artist was. His name is lost to us. But we do know the family posing here, and they are the Freaks. That's Elizabeth Clark Freak, and her husband was John, and baby Mary. And the reason I chose to show you this is because you can see that this particular artist is, first and foremost, I'll admit, he's doing art that I could never do. I am not creatively talented this way. So he is pulled off showing Mrs. Freak and her daughter. However, when you look at it, you see that it's just not quite there, right? It's not quite natural. And that's because the Freak painter, no fault of his own, is an amateur. He's self-taught. And so we tend to call these portraitists that do that are self-taught, we call them limners. And limners just suggest that they are self-taught, they're making a living, obviously they're catering to the wealthy in the colonies, and that's exactly what he's done here. Now we jump just a little further ahead into 1728, and we're still very much in colonial Britain. But even by this point, if I'm not mistaken, the last colony, Georgia, has, I think, been founded, at least by this time. So the colonies are complete. And what we are seeing is actual artists coming from Europe to move to the to move to the British colonies in America and try to make a living of it. And John Smebert is one of those artists who's successful in doing that. More importantly, John Smebert arrives in Boston as an educated, trained, and experienced artist. So when he's commissioned by this investment group and their wives, it's called the Bermuda Group, when he's commissioned to do this in 1728, he clearly is influenced by the European artists, the techniques. He is a trained artist. So this is actual portraiture. Group portraiture is the official title for this, or category. Let's see, Smebert not only painted portraits of the Boston elite, he also opened what is, in essence, the first art gallery in North America, most likely in North America, and most likely of all the colonies. And he displayed not only his work, but he also would travel to Europe, he would purchase paintings, and then he was skilled enough to reproduce them and sell them to a colonial audience. And a lot of times these are classically influenced paintings that he's purchased. And so these reproductions, even though they're not original, they are Smebert's, and they wind up in the homes of colonial people where their friends see them and then they think, oh, I think I'd like to have that too. And so an art business is born with John Smebert. But even more importantly, Smebert created not only this gallery, but he also began importing art supplies, and he began welcoming art students into the gallery, and so they could look at the Bermuda Group and study it and figure out if they could be that kind of artist. He could sell them supplies, and then he would also provide his expertise. And this became a major stopping point for the artists that we are about to explore. The type of artists that passed through his gallery and under his tutelage were John Singleton Copley, John Trumbull, Charles Wilson Peale, and Gilbert Stuart, all of whom are very prominent, ultimately American artists. So Smebert is the one that we really have to thank for launching Americans into thinking that they too could be artists. And now I want to show you that. I'm going to skip this next one because, for time's sake, and just go ahead and get into it. Here is John Singleton Copley, a personal favorite of mine. Just a very dramatic painter. You can see that he is using a great deal of skill on his own self-portrait. He's even got the tools. He's got a paintbrush that is so thin that he can do single strands of hair. And that's impressive. That's one of the hallmarks of what he's doing. That shows you that he's an accomplished artist. And then he takes these skills that he has and he creates not only great portraiture, but very historically important portraits. This is the earliest known portrait of Paul Revere, long before he became an American hero. Does anybody recall what Paul Revere did for a living? Silversmith. So there you see, I think that's a tea kettle, I'm not sure, a teapot. But notice also that John Singleton Copley, if you recall the Caravaggio, he clearly had studied Caravaggio. He's using tenebrism. And then he's just created this incredible likeness. It's very natural, it's very lifelike. You can tell that this is the trained hand of an experienced artist. So here we are in the 1760s, and the moment is arriving. The only problem is they're not Americans, per se. They're American colonists, but they're technically citizens of Britain. By the way, Copley also painted one of my favorite all-time paintings. This is the horrific scene of a young man named Watson who was attacked by a shark and lost a leg in the shark attack. And Copley reproduces the rescue. And you can see how dramatic it is. And again, such a skilled artist to not only take, to be able to account for multiple figures in this painting, but to also get the scale correct and all of that. So it makes for an incredible art. So unfortunately, Copley did not paint any Washington portraits. He left the colonies in 1774, just before the fighting started, and he moved to London, where he had a very successful career as a painter, sadly for us, but it was in London. So that would be an example of sort of an American moving to Europe and making his mark. That's what we can celebrate Copley for. So he didn't get to paint Washington, but of course he did a few others. And I think maybe even Ben Franklin. But anyway, Copley still represents America well. And then we get to the portraiture of Washington. Charles Wilson Peale, whose name I mentioned earlier with John Smibert. Peale was one of his students. Peale's also kind of classically trained. And this painting was, we think, the earliest known portrait of George Washington. Hangs in Mount Vernon, if I'm not mistaken. And it also hangs, no it doesn't, because her portrait's elsewhere. But anyway, Peale, let's see, he was hired by Martha Washington because she wanted a companion portrait for this. This is her portrait in 1757. That's the year her first husband died. But John Custis commissioned this from an artist named John Wollaston. Wollaston had trained with Smibert, so there's that connection again. And he created this lovely portrait. And obviously it's a young Martha Washington, or Custis at the time. By the way, this currently hangs at Washington and Lee University, so if you're looking for it. But she wanted a companion piece, and so she hired Peale to paint this. Now, he's doing this in the 1770s, 1772. But in fact, what you see here is George Washington from the French and Indian War. This is imagined to be the day that Washington led the Virginia Regiment into battle on behalf of the British forces during the French and Indian War. He is wearing the uniform of the Virginia Regiment. Peale has even recreated Washington's commission as an officer in the regiment. He wears the trappings of an officer, this neck piece and this sash, which would immediately denote him as an officer. And this, of course, brings Washington out of retirement because he had become a gentleman farmer. And so something that Peale did to show that Washington had sort of aged a little bit, maybe gotten a little soft. He's just got a bit of a punch right there, you see that? Suggesting a little bit of age. But I'm sure Martha weighed in on, I want a younger man to match my portrait. So make it look good, Charles. And he did. So that is what we believe to be the earliest portrait of Washington. And even at that point, he hated posing for them. That's going to be a lifelong thing for him, but he does it a lot. Our next artist, this is again Charles Wilson Peale. You can see how well his painting is progressing. This is from 1779 after the successful Battle of Princeton, and Washington carried the day there. And Peale was actually serving as a captain in the Army. So Peale was right there and able to paint these things. Our second artist, again, who comes from the John Smycre School, is John Trumbull. And here is one of his first portraits of Washington. But I chose this because unusually, you don't usually see enslaved people in portraits. And that is in fact William Lee, who was Washington's direct assistant on the battlefield. He was there helping the general. And so obviously both Washington and the artist thought enough about him to include him in the portrait. That's very unusual. And then Trumbull just keeps getting better and better, and we're gonna come back to him in the end. But as you can see here, he is celebrating Washington's victory at Trenton. So he is also growing as an artist right before our very eyes. But for sure, the guy who paints, I think, the best portraits of George Washington is Gilbert Stuart. Again, someone who passed 3 Smybert's, tutelage, and gallery, and becomes trained. And here is perhaps one of the most famous portraits of Washington. This is known as the Lansdowne portrait. And Gilbert Stuart really was trying to do what that artist did with Louis XIV that we saw. Really make him heroic, but also personalize him. And so what you see around Washington are attributes. For example, since he was the first president of the United States, that's an eagle carved in the leg of the table. So direct connection to that. You can see back here, there's a flag carved into the medallion of the chair. And so all of these things that just point to, that's George Washington. He's the guy. This, of course, is also an equally famous Gilbert Stuart. Says he never finished it. But does anybody recognize where you've seen this portrait perhaps most recently? Where? You got it. The dollar bill. That is the portrait that serves on our dollar bill. Probably Gilbert Stuart is the most accurate in capturing Washington in painting. And he even manages to do it later in his career after Washington's death when he paints some other things that I'll show you in just a moment. But I think Gilbert Stuart probably is the most accurate of the Washington portraitists. And you can clearly see that he is highly trained and highly experienced, an accomplished American artist for sure. But if you were to ask me what I think is the best portraiture of Washington, I would say that it's not painting, it's sculpture. And it's actually by a Frenchman by the name of Jean-Antoine Houdon. It's the bust of Washington, happened around 1785. What happened was that Houdon was sent, because of a commission, an art commission, he was sent to Mount Vernon, and he met Washington there. This is a couple of years into Washington's retirement from the American Revolution. And he convinced Washington to sit for a life mask, meaning that Houdon put plaster of Paris over Washington's face and made an exact replica of Washington's face. And then the first process is to turn that into sculpture, and so he did this bust. So that's why we regard this to be one of the better portraits of Washington, because it came from the life mask. But this is only the first step, because Houdon has been commissioned by the Virginia General Assembly to create a marble statue celebrating George Washington. And so from the bust, Houdon gives us what I think is the most impressive sculpture, and this is George Washington, which stands in the Richmond, Virginia Capitol. And it's just remarkable. So you've got that life mask face, which is basically showing us who Washington is at that late stage of his life. Again, Udon did his research, and he has included attributes so that you have no question in your mind that it's Washington. So, for example, here's the walking stick that he used on his farm. And then also, as the gentleman farmer, especially for cool mornings, he would have this older coat here that he would wear on the farm. Now, this object right here is called a fascus. That's from the Latin term. The Romans used it. A fascus is a bundle of wooden rods, and the idea is that it's a symbol of strength for unity. If you take a bundle of rods and you wrap them together tightly, you can't break that over your knee, right? Well, that's a symbol of strength. And what you see here is Udon has made a fascus of 13 rods, which symbolizes what? 13 colonies, very good. And then also hanging on that fascus are two more attributes, and that's why I have the side view. This is the map case and document carrier that he would use as a surveyor, his first career. And then right behind that, you can just barely make it out, actually you can see it better here, is a sword that he wore as a military general. This is also nicknamed Washington Cincinnatus. It is a very powerful portrait of Washington, and it's also so lifelike that it's 6 feet 2, which is what he was at his height. So it's very impressive. I'll close with just a couple of other images and kind of point out that there were things about Washington going on after his death. Washington died in 1799, and then there's another war, the War of 1812, and good old John Trumbull, he's brought back, and between 1822 and 1824, he paints this scene, which is painted on the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. And President Madison approved this, and Trumbull painted it. This is the moment in 1783 when Washington resigns from the Army. Peace, and the Treaty of Paris has been signed, the war's over, he resigns his commission and goes quietly into retirement. And that was also to signify what he did as president, because he's the man who set the standard as 2 terms before there was even a law to limit it. George Washington said, I'm done, I'm walking away. And that's when the first actual election is held and John Adams is elected. So, by the way, this rotunda painting also is timed to help repair the damage that the British caused when they burned Washington, D.C. And they did damage to the Capitol, the White House, and a lot of other parts of the town. So it's pretty important that they chose that. And then perhaps the most famous image of Washington was painted long after his death, 1851, Washington crossing the Delaware by German artist Emanuel Lutz. But again, what these portraitists tend to do is to capture the essence of Washington. And they also help to elevate American art into our imagination. Thank you very much for your time and attention.